So welcome everyone, Lucas here. Today's show is called Exploring the Hatha Pradipika. I'm here with Dr. Jim Mallinson. Jim Mallinson is a senior lecturer in Sanskrit and Classical and Indian Studies at SOAS, University of London. He's published 8 books. These are all editions and translations of Sanskrit yoga texts, epic tales, and poetry. He also co-authored a book with Dr. Mark Singleton, who I know some of you are familiar with. That book is called Roots of Yoga. Jim, welcome to the show. Appreciate you making the time.
Hi, Lucas. Well, thanks very much for having me on. It's great. Thank you.
I have a couple of very simple questions that I think get confused a lot in the yoga community. And the first one is people always refer to the Hatha Pradipika as the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. Is that a misnomer? Does it not really matter? Is that just us being yoga nerds? Is there any real?
Well, yeah, there's a sort of short answer to that. But I think at both levels, it's kind of wrong in that the text itself, in fact, I'm working on it now. I've got this project going on. I've got a team at SOAS in London, and there's a team from Marburg University in Germany to edit the text. And we've already got copies of over 100 manuscripts, I think, and there are at least 250 that we know. So it's a pretty daunting task. And in those manuscripts, they have at the end of them, normally at the end of the text, rather than like the beginning of a book that we would expect, at the end, they give the name of the text. And I think it's, probably of the 100 that we've looked at, 99, it's Hatha Pradipika.
Sure.
Maybe one is Hatha Yoga Pradipika. And when it's referred to elsewhere, it's always called the Hatha Pradipika within a Sanskrit text. So that's the kind of short, simple answer. The longer, more difficult answer is kind of what is Hatha, what is yoga? You've got to answer those questions.
Yeah. Because
in fact, normally, again, within the Sanskrit textual tradition, yoga is like the goal rather than the practice. Okay. Again, 90+% of the time, that's what yoga means. So Hatha is the method of reaching yoga. Okay, so the Hatha Pradipika means the light on the method Hatha, if that makes sense. So it kind of makes more sense for it to be Hatha Pradipika rather than Hatha Yoga Pradipika.
A couple of other simple but I think important questions. First one, Svatmarama, one person, multiple people, your publication, is publication even a thing? Oral tradition, written tradition? Do you have any indication, like from your best research, what does this really look like? And what is your ideas?
Yeah, I'm pretty confident it's one person. I think we can fix a date of around 1400. You can kind of tell. I mean, it's interesting. It's like the very first text on yoga, on physical yoga, which we can really attribute to a single person. Okay, well, I mean, I think they all were written by single persons, unless one kind of believes that Shiva or whoever the god was transmitted it, from on high. But within the text itself, it clearly says, I, Svatmarama, am writing this text in order to dispel, in order to shed light. That's why it's called the Hatha Pradipika. Pradipika means light or lamp on the, the darkness caused by the darkness of confusion caused by the many different doctrines or the many different teachings about yoga that were already in existence. And what he does at the same time is he draws from at least, we've identified about 20 so far, 20 earlier texts that he borrows from directly. Normally he just incorporates directly verses from other texts within his text. And so he's trying to sort of synthesize them and make sense of all these different teachings on yoga that were already around at that time.
And again, something I don't really, so written in Sanskrit, is that fair? And is this written? Is this on banana leaves? Is this oral tradition? It's really hard because we're talking about 600 years ago, basically, right?
Yeah. 600 years ago. Now, I'm pretty that by that time, writing was very common, and we have, there are much older manuscripts of Sanskrit texts around. And there's one text I've finished a book on, a text called the Amrita Siddhi, which indirectly contributes to the Hatha Pradipika. And the oldest manuscript we have of that is 12th century, so that's before the Hatha Pradipika was written. So I'm pretty sure. It'd be pretty amazing if he could hold all these other texts, 20 other texts in his head, and then make a compilation. And I think that's beyond even the most sort of genius kind of sages around. So I'm pretty sure he would have been sitting surrounded by lots of different manuscripts and then compiling from that. And what materials would it have been on? I mean, paper was just about around by then, but I think we can pinpoint him to region of sort of southeast India, the Deccan, called Andhra Pradesh.
Okay.
Where the chances are he would have been using palm leaves. Yeah, so they write on palm leaf manuscripts. But the thing is, in India, because of the extremes of climate, extremes of heat, it doesn't get so cold down there, but the huge variation in humidity, and in fact the high humidity down there, these manuscripts don't last very long. So they get copied and copied and copied. This is kind of a game of Chinese whispers as well. You're trying to work out what the original was. So that's what work is. I mean, I said about this Amrita Siddhi, we have got a manuscript of that's probably 12th century, but that's only because it was written in Tibet, where the atmosphere is really dry, so things can last.
I see.
Yeah.
And so the friction around publishing, the friction around any kind of information back then, and then the low probability of something getting the low probability of guys like you and me discussing this 600 years later, it means something, right? So my question is, in the context from your best research, there are other texts out there that in the cultural tradition of the 1400s, what did this represent? Like, it has to be something significant, or you and I wouldn't be chatting about it. Did it represent a cultural phenomenon? Was it's yoga continues to be relatively fringe today. It's mainstream, obviously, but still relatively fringe. For a text like this to survive 600 years, it's hard for me to believe that it would be fringe. What are your thoughts in terms of the role that it played in something that could be analogous or comparable today?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, why are there so many manuscripts of it still?
Why are they there? Yeah,
250 at least around.
Yeah.
I think but at that point, I mean, yoga was even more fringe in the 15th century.
Yeah.
But that is a turning point where it starts to become kind of relatively mainstream in India. Prior to then, it had been kind of a bit too sort of way out and extreme for the mainstream sort of orthodox traditions. And it's at about that point that we see this change, and it starts to be so I'm talking about physical yoga practice. The mainstream traditions were already engaging in yoga. Patanjali is like whatever, 1,000 years earlier.
Yeah.
And there was already lots of scholarly engagement with that. But the more physical practices were still seen as somewhat fringe. But it's around about then that this changes. And the Hathapradipika, for some reason, it's a good question. I'm not quite sure why. I mean, it is the first text, in fact, to totally foreground Hatha, so there's physical methods of yoga. So that may be, he got in there first, Svatmarama, I suppose. Also, it's very kind of cleverly non-sectarian. I mean, most of the yoga texts are quite non-sectarian, but particularly so. He really consciously leaves out things that might kind of alienate one group or another. For example, there's no chakras. I mean, people would probably imagine, this is the key text on yoga. It's going to teach chakras, but in fact, and there's another kind of misconception that the system of chakras that we all know of, with 6 plus 1, sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 7, but the kind of most accepted is the system of 7. That was, never the only system. There were lots of competing systems from different schools. So I think that may be the reason he leaves them out completely. I think it's one passing reference to chakras, but he certainly doesn't list them or number them. I think, and the reason behind that is because he doesn't want to, highlight one particular teaching. So that's another reason why it became so important. Yeah, and I think it's just, this is the turning point where, so over the course of 15th, 16th, 17th century, we see many more kind of orthodox scholars who are putting together compendiums and text teachings on yoga. They start incorporating these physical methods, and he kind of gets in there first. So yeah.
From an academic perspective, when you look at ancient texts from India, if you look at something like the sutras, very, very different than something like the Hathapradipika. How do you think about these? Like, is one kind of a pop layman's guide? I mean, for people who haven't looked at the Hathapradipika, there's weird stuff in there. There's kriyas where you drink salt water and vomit. There's weird mudras and kind of what you might think of as sort of modern self-care techniques. In fact, some of these are mimicked in Panchakarma, Ayurveda, or just pop cleanses that you find online, things like this today. It's not. It really stands out, is what I mean. If you take a look at these, they often get thrown in the same category as the sutras. Obviously, it's way more contemporary, but that couldn't be more different. You go from these sort of proverbs, esoteric one-liners in terms of how you should live your life, to very, very practical things about sticking in a bamboo tube up your bum and jumping in the river. It's a very different. It's a very different approach. How do you? I mean, you live in the the world of academia, how does this text land? Like, does it sit as a pop cultural reference? Does it sit as it's not a sacred text, right?
Would you say it's not a sacred text? Well,
do you consider it a sacred text?
That's a very tricky question. I mean, to some extent, anything written in Sanskrit and presented as a no, I don't think it would be worshipped as such. No, it's not seen as a revelation. Like, as I say, it's the first, the first text of its kind that is attributed to a human author. Although that's on Hatha Yoga again, but Patanjali, of course, is a human author. But as you say, Patanjali, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is a very different type of text, much more difficult, to be honest. I mean, as you say, there's esoteric, weird stuff in the Hathapradipika, but the Sanskrit itself is relatively easy to translate. You don't.
The
terminology, once you understand this yogic terminology, is relatively straightforward. Whereas the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is extremely difficult. You mentioned the book that Mark Singleton and I put together, Roots of Yoga. I mean, in that we have translations from over 150 different texts, and definitely the hardest one to translate is Patanjali. So I always find it somewhat ironic that it's seen as like, the book for modern yoga practitioners, because it doesn't include any physical techniques at all. And it's incredibly difficult. It's basically for Brahmin scholars, real experts in the Sanskrit kind of philosophical tradition. It's a totally different kind of work. Whereas, the Hathapradipika is a manual of physical yoga practice. And sure, some of those techniques are quite obscure. You say it's sort of crossover with Panch Karma and Ayurvedic kriyas. And that's an interesting point because, in fact, a colleague of mine, Jason Birch, he's looked into this a bit, and I've looked into it a bit over the years. There's actually a bit of a distinction. I mean, that some of the principles of Ayurveda are acknowledged in the Hathapradipika, but I think we can draw a distinction in that they teach practices which you do on your own. That's very much the kind of, if you were a yogi living in the forest or whatever, you can get your bamboo pipe and do your auto enema and so forth. Whereas Ayurveda, you're kind of employing a doctor to come and do stuff for you. So I think those are the different realms that they live in. In terms of whether it's sort of part of pop culture, I mean, I think scholars. I've been very lucky in my scholarly career in that somewhat not by it wasn't a deliberate choice, but when I started working on Sanskrit manuscripts of yoga texts in 1995, I chose a Hatha Yoga text for my PhD, and at that point, no one had done that. Okay,
but I was gonna say you've picked a very, very unique area of study. Nobody goes down this path.
But it was still pretty fringe then. You say yoga is still quite fringe, but nothing like it was then. That's a big industry, and within academia, this world of Hatha Yoga was kind of seen as pretty wacky kind of. Not because it doesn't really have a particularly strong sort of philosophical tradition to go with it. You don't. It's not. It didn't appeal to the usual scholar who is happy to go rummaging around in libraries in India finding manuscripts and going through all the different variant readings and this very technical work. So I was probably the first person to do that, pretty much, to do a critical edition of one of these texts. But I think now, of course, scholarship is also driven to some extent by what's going on in the wider world. So I've been lucky in that this, the growing phenomenon that is yoga around the world has meant that, I can get funding for research projects and so forth. Whereas I think if you tried 50 years ago to get sort of funding and going for it wasn't going to happen. I guess it probably was, these texts were to some extent looked upon by regular scholars as a bit too sort of, A, bit weird, and B, a bit kind of, pop culture in a way. Yeah.
If we look at like the contemporary mind-body yoga fitness movement, of which I'm very much a part of, and we look back at like the historical roots of that, I always find much more affinity with the Hatha Pradipika than something like the sutras, even though for whatever reason, yoga schools and yoga organizations, they tend to reference the sutras so often. There just isn't a lot of apples to apples comparison with what guys like me do in places like this and what you find in the Yoga Sutras. In fact, there's none. And with the Hatha Pradipika, it's pretty clearly, there's some fringe weird stuff, but it's much more similar than it is different. And I'm curious why you think that is, why people lean so heavily into the sutras, which even went missing for a very long time, and why the Hatha Pradipika is so ignored. And if you agree with my general thesis that the Hatha Pradipika is much more of a reference if we look back to older texts.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And this is actually something. So I've just finished a 5-year project, really looking at the core texts of the Hatha Yoga tradition, which has then set me up to be able to do this next project on the Hathapradipika itself, because we've edited a lot of the texts that go into making the Hathapradipika. And before starting that project, I, like everyone else, I think, reckon that, okay, so we see these Hatha physical yoga texts appearing from about 1,000 years ago, but surely there was an older tradition of practice of this nature. And now I don't think there is, because A, the texts appear then, and B, in the kind of material culture, it's only from about 800-900 years ago that we first start seeing statues on temples and things like that, showing the more complex asana practice and so forth. So what I think happens is about 1,000 years ago, there's a complete revolution in yoga practice in which the body becomes something to be cultivated, something to be used as, it's still aimed towards higher meditative mystical states. But it's to be used, it's to be cultivated by doing these postures, these cleanses, these kriyas, these mudras, these special techniques for manipulating the vital energies. There you can thereby use the body to bring about these states. Whereas prior to that point, our only evidence, and Patanjali is part of this earlier tradition, in which the body is something to be kind of controlled or subdued, mortified even. So the only physical methods we read about in texts, or we see again in sort of temples, statues and so forth, are these techniques of kind of mortifying the body, where you hold your 1 or 2 arms up in the air for 12 years. So I think you're absolutely correct that there's, I always, as I've already said, I think it's somewhat ironic that Patanjali's Yoga Sutra gets so valorized within the modern yoga tradition. And the reason for that is, I think, is because it probably goes back to the kind of, to some extent, the beginnings of, external interest in Indian religious traditions, and coming out of, the first scholars looking at these traditions will always kind of try to home in on the, the key original texts of the tradition. And so if you ask in India, what is the root text of yoga, you'll be told it's Patanjali. And sure enough, for scholarly traditions, it is the basis of the philosophy, because yoga has its own, it's quite slightly complicated in that, there's yoga, nowadays you'll hear it's like 6, the Indian philosophical traditions are split into 6, of which 1 is yoga. And that is a very distinct, specific, well articulated philosophy. But actually it's slightly complicated in that just about all Indian religious traditions will also practice yoga, and they might have different philosophies from the yoga philosophy, if that makes some sense. Yeah. So that's why Patanjali has such an important position within the yoga tradition. And just one thing I want to pick up on that you mentioned, that some people have said that Patanjali's text kind of disappeared, sort of went underground for several hundred years. I don't think that's actually true. I know the scholars who've written this, but in fact, Mark and I have a note in Roots of Yoga. I would refute that. It's always, if you look at manuscript catalogues and so forth, it's still getting copied and copied and copied throughout the centuries up to the modern era. But again, it's only for the use of, really dedicated scholarly Sanskrit Brahmins who are kind of working on Sanskrit texts. It's not for the so I spent a lot of time, as well as working on texts and manuscripts and so forth. I spent a lot of time in India living with traditional yogis, guys who are whittling their bamboo pipes and doing, I've done all that, and doing bhasti out in rivers in the forest and so forth. And these guys are not reading Patanjali. That's for sure. They probably are reading the Hathapradipika. Right. They are to some extent, but mainly they're learning their yoga practice through an oral tradition. But you have to be a very kind of accomplished Sanskritist and understand complicated Indian philosophy in order to read Patanjali.
What are some of the challenges with translations? You mentioned the Sanskrit of the sutras is a lot harder to manage than the Sanskrit of Hathapradipika. What do pop culture people like me not understand about looking at old texts and attempting to turn them into English? What are some of the potential landmines or misnomers that end up in the zeitgeist?
Well, I'd like to say nothing at all. If you read one of my translations, surely it's very clear. Well, yeah, there's a lot of complicated terminology. It's difficult to know how to translate a lot of the terms, and I generally veer on the side, if a term is too complex, I will just leave it in Sanskrit often.
Interesting.
Something like a mudra,
sure.
the Hathapradipika is the first text really to kind of bring Hatha Yoga into the mainstream, and it's the first text to include like complicated asanas under the rubric of Hatha. But it also, so it says that the three main components, three distinctive components, are asana, so posture, and then mudra. So mudra, within these Hatha texts, mudra means some kind of physical method for manipulating the vital energies within the body. But its basic meaning is a seal. Okay, literally, a seal that you put on a letter or a manuscript and stamp with wax. If something is mudrita, that means sealed. But that sometimes in some of the usages that works. Like Khichdi mudra is this esoteric technique where you seal the back of the throat. You seal the back of the throat. Exactly. So there, that idea works. But in other ones, it doesn't really work. So do you translate it as seal or don't you? And I generally, decide not to. But sometimes, depending on the context. So I think, there are some words that are almost untranslatable. There are, as that Khichdi mudra as well. The name Khichdi in itself, that's what I did my PhD on. I did my PhD on there's one text that specifically teaches about the Khichdi mudra. So the word Khichdi originates in that context. It literally means, it's a feminine word, and it means she who moves through the sky. So there's this idea of these flying yoginis. And so in earlier tantric traditions, there's this idea of these flying yoginis, and by doing these really crazy esoteric rituals involving, sexual products and so forth, you can please these flying goddesses and they'll come down to earth and give you whatever you want. But then it gets reworked to be this this physical practice involving the tongue. But then there's a kind of lucky coincidence that Khichdi can also be understood, and the tongue is a feminine word, so jihwa in Sanskrit, but Khichdi can also be understood as that which moves in space. And what you do in Khichdi mudra is you're putting your tongue up into the space, the hollow above the soft palate. So there's no way you can get all that in a translation. Do you know what I mean? There's so many different things going on there. So I mean, sometimes, but at the same time, I do sometimes call it and then there's this other idea that by doing the practice, you can then fly, moving in space again. So I sometimes would call it maybe the sky roving seal. But that, again, even that doesn't encompass all the nuances of meaning within the term itself. So it is pretty tricky. I think you can get, when you're teaching the basics of a physical practice, it's pretty straightforward. If you put a leg here and your arm there, we've all got legs and arms and we've all put in the same places. But some of the kind of contextual understandings of the purposes and so forth and the reasons for doing the practices are rather harder to convey. That's why my books tend to have quite long footnotes.
So looping back to Svatmarama, like, what's your best guess? Let's say 600 years ago, this book in whatever format is published. I don't know. Whatever happens in his publishing party, what does this look like? Are people running around doing weird kriyas and suddenly has followers in loincloths? And is it a collective organization? Is it a group? Is he a teacher? Is he a speaker? Is he a recluse? Is he an academic? No idea at all. Like, did this create a movement where suddenly, people are practicing posture and breath and kriya and mudra? Is that happening?
Yeah, well, no, I think lots of people will have already been doing this all over the place. Okay,
so it's a codification. It's a codification of what was already in the
because we've got other texts. He's drawing on lots of other texts. But I think what my best guess these days of what was going on, and this is I've been pondering this for a long time, 20 years, and the level 25 years, and my best theory at the moment for why we get these texts, because it's quite odd. Like I say, why are these texts written in Sanskrit, which is a difficult language, and most yogis, today and probably then as well, would not have been experts in Sanskrit, and the practices would have probably been transmitted orally, from practitioner to pupil or teacher to pupil. But at the same time, what I think was going on was, as this physical yoga movement took hold and it becomes more and more popular, the different traditions, different religious traditions, of which, one must remember that within India there were loads, there were lots of different, you've got dualists, non-dualists, monists, whatever, followers of Vishnu, followers of Shiva, followers of the goddess, and so forth. And all these different religious lineages had monasteries around the place, okay, which functioned a bit like universities. So I think what was going on was each of those lineages, each of those traditions was producing its own text on physical yoga. And they, because they were monasteries, they were full of learned, usually Brahmin males. That's why they're writing in Sanskrit. So it's like, they're producing like the academic monographs of the time, basically for each other. They're kind of talking to each other, which is why they're borrowing verses from each other's texts and so forth. So with Svatmarama, what I think happened was he was associated with a tradition called Virashaivas, probably based in a place. I mean, I'm not certain about this, but this is my best guess at the moment. In a place called Sri Shailam in Andhra Pradesh, which is still a wonderful, beautiful pilgrimage place. With an amazing ship. In fact, there's a great temple there with this huge prakara wall around the outside, which is covered in carvings of yogis and so forth. I think he was commissioned by a monastery there, a Virashaiva monastery there. He would have been a local Brahmin scholar, probably a brilliant guy. This is a very important, powerful monastery, and the head of the monastery would have asked him to put this text together, so it could be their contribution, their handbook of physical yoga practice. And again, even though they were associated with different lineages, they tried to make them not too sect specific, which is why, as I said earlier, there's not too many exclusive things in there. It's basically anyone can do this, but this is art. So it'd be like a different yoga schools today around the world, each one putting out its own handbook. They're not going to say you can only do our yoga if you're part of our group. No, they're trying to make it appeal to everyone. So I think that's what was going on.
And in terms of like application, do you imagine this being as part of a ritualized prayer / meditation / something in these monastery temple?
Well, yes, but again, that's not it's not tied to the text. So that's the idea. So you could do your yoga practice, but the rest of the ritual, worship, meditation, and so forth that you do could be just, is not specified within the text. So, if you're going to do yoga, you can use Svatmarama's manual, but then if you're going to do your worship, depends which god you worship. If you're from one of these tradition that worships Vishnu, then you do your Vishnu stuff. If it's a Shiva worshipping tradition, you do your Shiva stuff. But if you when it comes to yoga, if you like Svatmarama's manual the best, then you're going to use his one, I think.
I guess what I'm always trying to put together the puzzle pieces in my head is like when I do yoga practices, whether it's a breathing or an asana practice or meditation, I'm usually just trying to manage my lifestyle stress. I'm trying to, that's my main objective, and or like stay in shape, these kinds of things. And I'm fairly certain that 600 years ago, like staying limber or staying in shape, I really doubt that was like priority number one for the usage. And so I'm always trying to think about like what was the use, and obviously there's always this reference to divinity, to samadhi, to nirvana, to altered states of consciousness, esoteric goals and aims and things like this. And so I'm just trying to think of why someone would go through postures, breathing, kriyas, mudras, in what context that would play out in their life, because their daily lives were so much more about survival than any of us can even comprehend in this sort of cozy cush world that we live in. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, it does say that specifically within the Hathapradipika and a couple of the texts that it's derivative of, that by doing asana, that gives you good health. And the word for good health is arogya, which means, not having diseases. But it also says quite specifically, makes you thin and makes your body supple. So it's not that
maybe they were thinking about it. Yeah.
But then that is all in hoc to the higher purpose, of them being able to, so there's a kind of, there is a grade of practice that so that once that's a kind of preparatory thing, so that you can then do these mudras, these kind of more esoteric practices, and they are kind of used in tandem with meditation, various different techniques of meditation and so forth. So I think, what I imagine is similar to the traditional yogis I've lived with in India. It would have been a similar situation in that, so most yogis would do an intense period of practice for a few years, when they're quite young, probably, under 20 or whatever. And so they really dedicate themselves to all these asanas and breath control and so forth. And then they would concentrate more on the higher practices. But when they're, so my guru, for example, if we were at a festival for 2 or 3 weeks or something, you get pretty knackered sitting around, and then you go off to the forest and do a few days of asanas and cleanses and so forth to get your body back on track, to keep your body in a good state to continue doing the higher practices. They would tend to, you do it daily and intensively for a few years, and then you would just drop in and out of doing the kind of asanas and breath control and so forth.
Sure. Jim, great conversation. For people listening, I know that you've got a number of books. I know that you have an online course as well. We have quite a lot of yoga teachers and studio owners listening. Tell people where they can find you online.
Oh, online. Well, I work at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and we are actually in the process, probably a bit behind the curve, but we're developing some online courses there. I've also done some things I've done one, I'm going to do another for Seth Powell's Yogic Studies. In terms of books, there's my Roots of Yoga with Mark Singleton that you mentioned, which is Penguin Classics. And then a lot of my articles, just about all my kind of academic articles, are available. You can just download them directly from my academia.edu page. And then over the course, I've just literally 2 or 3 days ago sent in the first of, there's going to be 10 outputs from my recent research project. So the basic texts, which in fact a lot of them then contributed to the Hathapradipika. That's called the Amrita Siddhi. So just keep an eye out. I mean, I'll be putting them again on my academia.edu page, because it's funded by the European Union, that project. Everything's going to be freely available. You can buy the books if you want, but the PDFs and stuff will all be freely available. So yeah, academia.edu is the best place probably to look for my written work.
Perfect. Well, Jim, thanks so much. Let's keep in touch.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Lucas. That was fun.